reason. So here in the southern Honeyway Valley, thank you for coming, by the way. I should have started with that. Here in the southern Honeyway Valley, this is a really great habitat for breeding amphibians. So there's a handful of salamanders and frogs that will, especially the salamanders, live most of their life up on the hillsides. And the first warm spring rain at nighttime, they venture down and they're here into the wetlands to breed. So they'll be traveling across the road tonight. And so us as a college like to help them cross the road and slow down traffic coming through so that we reduce the chances of them getting hit in the road. So a lot of them, this is a busy road, will get ran over if they're hard to see at night, especially when it's raining. So we're just trying to do our part and help the amphibians get to where they need to go so that they can reproduce for further generations. So we will be doing that following this presentation. We are accepting volunteers if anyone wants to stay and help. It's a really cool opportunity to see multiple species of amphibians. However, if you do want to stay, we ask that you stay for the whole time. So we probably wouldn't finish up until about 9:30 or 10 o'clock at night. And that is because we're trying to also reduce the traffic of you leaving and running them over as well. So if when we wrap up the presentation, we ask that you either leave, not because we don't like you, but so that you leave before they start crossing once it gets dark out, or you can stay, and if you stay, then you have to stay until, you know, kind of late, 9:30, 10. So
will we be doing this again?
It's hard to say. The weather dictates that. So tonight's probably going to be the biggest push for them, but in following rainy nights, it's possible that there might be slower migrations, not as many, because the majority of them have already crossed. But it's possible that if there's another rainy night or two in the next couple of days or next week or so, there still would be some crossing.
Do you put it on Facebook?
Not really. It's this kind of sweet spot of us wanting to involve the public, but it can get too crazy of us trying to also manage people for people's safety up on the road as well. We want to make sure that we have a handle on all the people that are helping us. So you're here, which is really awesome. And if you want to stay, you are welcome to, if you're able to stay for the whole thing. So
what would we be doing as a volunteer?
Walking, thank you for asking, walking up and down the road. And if you find an amphibian, you can pick it up and you put it on the other side of the road. But
Yard like a grass.
species of the salamanders and frogs, and it is really, really cool to see them in hand.
Do we get to wear a special outfit?
We have reflective vests for people for safety reasons. So yes, yeah.
Red spotted reflective vest.
Yeah. Yeah. So if you have questions about any of that when we finish up, please feel free to ask. But without further ado, this is Mark Deutschlander. He's a professor at Hobart William Smith, and he is going to be giving a great presentation on his research with telemetry and migrating songbirds. So I'll let you give a little bit of your background if you wish.
Okay.
And enjoy the presentation.
All right. I think I need to be right here for the people who are online. So, which is hard for me not to move, but I'll try. So thank you all for coming. If I had known it was going to be a migration of salamanders tonight, I would have dusted off all my PhD slides, because my PhD is on eastern red-spotted newts. So I spent a lot of years studying them. And I was telling some people back, basically if it migrates, I'll study it. So there's the commonality between birds and newts. So I am going to talk about how we track migratory birds. I'm going to get into the radio tracking of migratory birds, which is the work that I'm now doing and a lot of other people are now doing. But also sort of put that in the general context of how we can watch and understand what's going on with bird migration. So I need to do a little switching around here. So everybody online is already seeing what is on the screen. So I just wanted to let you know about two places that are really great resources for you to look at migratory birds and migration. One is called Birdcast, which is shown up here. Has anybody seen or used Birdcast before? Okay, so just a couple. That's awesome. So Birdcast is from the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. They use some of the techniques of how we study birds I'm going to talk about to generate this data, and they use past data sets to make predictive models of when you can expect hot nights of bird migration. So it is literally a forecast of bird migration. So I'll just show you the page. There's a couple tools on here you're going to want to be familiar with. There are migration forecast maps, which are coded to how much migration will occur by color. And you can check those out. You can get alerts for your area. And you can look at live migration maps that show either while migration is happening, or you can go back to past nights and you can see these colors change in this map as time goes on through the night. And this has just started up, so they only run this during fall and spring migration. And so it's live now. And so I'll show you the dashboard just really quick. I'll put in, oh no, it's not by that, by county. We're in Ontario County?
Yep.
We are, cool. So I thought. All right, so this is the migration dashboard. So last night, 21,000 birds crossed over the county. So, and peak migration traffic was almost 8,000 birds flying over at one moment. And here you can see the context of a night. So on the side, you can see birds in flight. So this shows for last night. Move that. Right, how many birds are in flight at different times? You can see flight direction and speed in this one, and you can see altitude to see how high up those birds were. And over on the right side, you can see the birds in flight showing the season thus far and where we're heading. So that darker, under that gray curve, you can see sort of what's expected in terms of the number of birds that will be moving through before the end of spring migration. That's based, I think, on it's a historic data set. Don't quote me. I think it's like a 10-year data set of what they expect.
It's awkward.
So, oh, great. Yeah, and then over here, they tell you expected things. So what things should be migrating through that they might have picked up during those nightly hours. And that's based on eBird data. So they compile data from about weather. They compile data from eBird. They compile data from weather radar, which I'm going to show you how that works to generate these forecasts. Just to show you like what that looks like, I'll go, and you can go back in time. So I'm just going to go back a year from now. So let's see if I can do that, make that work. What was that? No, it didn't go back a year. It worked earlier when I did it. Here, let's do it up here. Maybe I gotta go this way. Yeah, so here you can see this is a comparison to last year, same date. But there you can see since last season happened, right? You can see all the nights of migration, right? And you can see there are bursts of migration on certain nights where you get large numbers of birds moving through, like this peak there was May 14th, right? So the estimated number of birds was over 200,000 birds that night. But depending on the county and the place, these numbers can get like astronomically high, like shockingly high. So this is a great resource for you to look at. Another resource, if you're interested in bird migration, is Audubon just came out with this last fall. This is the Audubon migration page, Migratory Explorer. And on here you can look up any bird species, and it'll show you what we understand about their migration based on all kinds of scientific studies. So you can put in a particular species, see its pathway based on some of the tracking techniques I'm using, some of the eBird data that goes into this, right? And it's basically showing you what we know about that particular species. And there are tons of different species in here. So that's another place to explore, right? That's what it's for, the Migration Explorer, if you're interested in that. All right, so I'm going to switch over, guys. Stop sharing and reshare. Perfect. All right, hopefully everybody online can see that. Allie, let me know if my slides are not up, okay? She's downstairs. Okay, so I'm going to talk about radiotracking, but also some other techniques. So how you can track birds, right? We already talked about that, a couple of different ways. I'm going to go over how biologists study migration, the different ways we do that. talk about some of my research interests, and then look at some local projects using this thing called Motus. So one way that scientists track birds are through all of you who go birding. And if you put your data into things like eBird, who's used eBird? Cool, that's like good, half the room, right? So I'm a bad user of eBird. I use it to look at when the birds are coming through, and I'm very bad at putting my own stuff in, unless I see something rare, like I saw the tufted duck on Seneca Lake the other day, so that went in. But scientists use citizen science data, eBird, to study bird migration, as all of you out there birding are a wonderful resource for learning about where birds are and when they are there. And ornithology is one of the only areas I know that has this sort of huge number of people that are non-scientists looking at birds that scientists can then collect that data and use. I mean, there are other like littler examples, but ornithology on literally a global scale has this access to things like all these birders in all these different countries who can put in their eBird data, right? And they use that. But also things like Project Feeder Watch, the Breeding Bird Survey, Christmas bird counts, those all contribute to what we know about birds. And there's an eBird map. I don't know if you guys have seen the eBird maps. I love watching maps of migration. So this is for yellow-rumped warbler, showing date as we're tracking on the bottom left of the screen and showing where they go, right, across the country, right, and how fast they move. And you'll see when they migrate, it's quite fast, right? So the migration period for most birds is, for a species, may last a month and a half for that species to go from where it's going each fall and spring. And then it has these longer periods where it's either breeding, which is actually a pretty short period too, or where they're wintering. And for most birds, their wintering sites are where they're spending a good 6 months or more of the year. So I mentioned birdcast. And one of the things that they're using for their data are looking at radar. So when you look at the maps of migration happening, they're actually putting together information from radar. And it's the same radar used to predict weather. So out here, there's some weather moving. And this is from, 2016, October 24th, going into the 25th. This is fall. You can see weather out here below this picture, right? But over on the East Coast and into the Midwest, you're seeing detections of birds. And you can tell they're birds by the way it looks around the radar. It doesn't have that look of like a rainstorm moving. It forms a donut shape around the radar, right? And that's because birds are coming up off the ground and coming into the radar beam and getting caught by that. And the radar basically picks up water, right? And anything biological is mostly water. So birds are mostly water, and they get picked up in the, by the radar. So the way that works, right? So you have this NexRad radar stations across the country. Each one has a beam that's circling around in the sky, right? And taking a slice of the sky to get that image of what's going on in terms of the radar, right? So here's a picture of one of those. The closest one to here is the one on the thruway as you go by Buffalo Airport, I think. And then you can get things like this. There's that donut shape. So this shows the number of birds in the sky. Although we don't know quite, we have to sort of make estimates about what radar densities mean about numbers. But also Doppler radar. You've all heard Doppler radar, right? And so you can use Doppler to look at the overall movement of the bird. So in this case, they are moving, I'm not sure. So they're moving that way. So they're moving south. And you can tell by the color codes on that. So this is a density plot. This is what we call a velocity plot, which tells you direction. So that's what feeds into birdcast. And that's what this guy back here, Sig Gotro, discovered a long time ago, that there was this magic eye of radar that could tell us about birds in the sky. And actually, military people who ran radar installations found this out first because they had these detections and they couldn't figure out what they were. They called them angels because they really didn't know what they were, but they found out later they were biological targets like insects and birds. So radar densities are great. It's good way you can see the mass movements of migration, but you don't know like what birds are in here, right? You don't know individual species. You don't know, even more species. You don't know, are they males, are they females, are they young birds, right? So it tells you about the populations out there, but not much about individuals. So the way we track individuals is by, I don't know why that, not on my screen. The way we track individuals is by marking them. And the oldest technique of marking them is bird banding. Has anybody seen bird banding done? Okay, yeah. I'm here, so I figured maybe it's been demonstrated here before. And this is a really distracting place to give a talk. Every time a bird flies by, I'm like, what is that? So bird banding, obviously, it's a way of marking the birds with these aluminum bands that come from the U.S. Geological Survey. And they're each individually have an individual number on them, right? And you put that on the bird, you let it go, and then if somebody else captures that bird elsewhere, right, you can learn information about, where it's gone. Banding is a really powerful technique, but the number of birds that get recaptured at other places is extremely small. If it's 5%, it's a large number for a particular species. So lots of those birds get those silver bands, and then they're released and they're never seen again. So most of what we get, most of the data we get from banding is really that first time capture. We learn about those birds, and we just hope by banding lots of them that we'll get some that are recaptured and learn about where they've gone. But it's a technique that's been around for a while. It's certainly the cheapest technique. And so we can monitor migration. So we do this at the Braddock Bay Bird Observatory, where I do a lot of my work, and I'm currently president for the observatory. That's up on the South Shore Lake Ontario on the other side of Rochester. Has anybody been to the Braddock Bay Bird Observatory? Oh, sweet. What's that?
I was there last week.
You were there last week? Okay. So there we monitor migration every fall and spring. So we do it for about 6 to 8 weeks. Nets are open every day, unless it's bad weather. And that's because migration happens, as I showed you on that birdcast data, it happens in spurts. And you never know when there's going to be a big push, right? Now we have these forecasting techniques, but we monitor every day. So even if it's a slow day and there's not a lot of birds that have come through and are being caught, we're there, or somebody's there, I'm not there. And then we hope for those big push days. So on a slow day at Braddock Bay, we have 34 nets. You might get 20 birds. That's an extremely slow day. I have 34 nets open for 6 hours. But on a big day, we might get 300 to 400 birds, and that's an insanely busy and hectic day of banding. So that's one way we track them. Of course, when we have them in our hands, we collect data. So we get data about the size, their wing length, their tarsus length. Oh, this is actually, if I touch this, it works. Oh, okay. Try not to touch it. And then sometimes we collect things like feather samples and blood samples to get genetic data, or blood samples can give us information about triglycerides and things that the birds need for fueling their migration. And there you can see measuring a wing. So we're getting wing as a measure of length. So 5% is not really great. So if we want to learn more about where birds go, okay, that's there. Technology is helping us do that. So there are transmitters that have been developed in the past decade or so that allow us to track birds and get a lot more information about where they're going. And it is really, between what's going on with birdcast and the radar and all the tracking technology, it is the golden age to study bird migration. We are learning more about it now than we have for decades. So here, this was the first kind of tracking that was done using a tracker called the geolocator. And all these things look similar. They're little things that go in the backs of the birds, but they work a little differently. So geolocators actually log light levels, and you can use the light levels and information about when the sun rises and sets to calculate roughly lat and longitude of where these birds are. And so this was one of the first tracking studies that was ever published using geolocators and any kind of sensor besides a band. And it was done on purple martins and wood thrush. And there you can see some of the tracks that were published by these biologists. The thing with geolocators are you have to get them back. So they log this information like a little computer on the back of the bird, but I have no way of getting that information until I capture that bird again. So you have to do this on birds that you know have high return to a site. Right, so you would do it in a breeding bird population. So purple martins go back to their boxes, right? So that's one good reason. to study purple martins. But at Braddock Bay, it's a stopover site, and most of the birds that we see there never come back through, or we don't see them again. So if I put a geolocator on birds at Braddock Bay, I would be wasting $200 a geolocator as I send them off, because I probably would not get most of them back. Okay, so you got to get them back. But it can give you rich data. So another thing is satellite data. So here's some satellite data from Beijing cuckoos. This is from the Beijing Cuckoo Project, which you can look up on the web, showing tracks of birds moving from China, right, all the way down to southern Africa. Satellite tags, first of all, you can see they're pretty big, so they're not small enough to put on really small songbirds. And even though they give you great data, at least when the satellite's around the side of the planet where the bird is on, they are super expensive. So geolocator tags are $200. These are at least $2,000. And so that's an expensive technique. I don't have the budget for that. So Motus, tracking with radio tracking. So this is really useful for studying most migrants. The tags, you can see one tag here, are about the cost of geolocator tags, so they're about $200. They can be pretty small, so you can put them on fairly small birds. And one thing you might be asking is, like, these birds are flying, you're adding weight, isn't that compromising them? So any tag you add to a bird cannot be more than 3% of that bird's lean body mass. So it's got to be a very light tag, okay? So the idea here is these tags emit a radio signal and get picked up by radio towers. So this is using radio telemetry, which is a very old technique in terms of studying wildlife. When I was an undergraduate, I went to Geneseo. I remember running around campus. We put collars on squirrels, and we had an antenna. We had to run around and find them and figure out where they were and log their behavioral data and stuff like that. But every squirrel was on a different frequency. So you had to find, you tune your AM radio to the frequency of the squirrel, and you can only look for one squirrel at a time. These devices all work on one frequency, and they're digitally encoded. So they send a code saying basically it's like a electric band, if you want to think about it that way. It sends a code to a radio receiving tower or a radio receiving device that tells you what particular tag it is. And so you can actually look for birds all on one frequency, right, and listen for them all on one frequency and see when they're passing by things like this radio tower, okay? So the key to Motus is lots of people doing it and coordinating. So I just stole this from the Motus website, some of the people who got this started. This actually started in Canada through Bird Studies Canada and a guy named Phil Taylor who was at the University of Acadia way over here in Nova Scotia. And what you're seeing here are when they made this poster, the locations, each one of those blue dots is the location of a radio receiving tower. And they're all in a network, right? We share all this information through a network. And so you get this tracking station, this nano tag on a bird, right? Whatever the bird is, right? Or you can put them on even smaller things like butterflies, right? And when they fly by these towers, like within 10 to 15 kilometers, you get a detection on that tower. So when I first started this, I was told, well, you can't count on your birds getting detected anywhere but your tower. So you want to put up a tower and tag birds near a tower so you can learn about their movements when they move away. But the network has grown, right? And so the network is huge now. So this is September of last year. All these yellow dots are towers. And you can see they're overlapping because we're at such a far distance. So if I zoom in a little bit more, right? See more towers, right? I'm going to zoom into our area. So these are the locations of towers. So the ones nearby us, there's some over in Montezuma. There's one up at Braddock Bay. Hugo Bird Club's put some on south end of Hugo Lake, down in Ithaca. Right, but all these towers are put up by different people, sometimes bird clubs, but often researchers who are asking questions about birds in their area, or sometimes bats. A lot of the Midwest stuff was driven by bat research.
They preen, they hit that little antenna sticking off the back of them, preening or cleaning themselves. Can't they just pop that?
Yes.
With their beak and chuck it?
Sometimes they can damage it, but yeah, it depends. And it depends on the species. So in Australia, they tried doing this. There's some Motus towers in Australia. magpies, and the magpies helped each other get them off. Right, so yeah, so you gotta know your species. And we've had one antenna that was damaged. It fell off a bird, and it obviously pulled it off, and it like curled the antenna around as it preened it off. Yeah. So every time I see a tower go off, I'm giddy about the towers going up, because that means another possible site where birds that I tag in this area might get detected elsewhere. So this network is there. You might be driving by these towers. You don't even know they're there. Sometimes they're on other existing towers or on, cellular towers and things like that. You can, put your antennas up there and get permission to do those. One cool thing is there's a lot of regional networks that are being developed to basically cover the ground, right? So if I go back, right, tons in the Northeast, good for up here, right? Not so many down here in the Southeast. So there's a Southeast regional Motus group that's strategically just trying to put towers up in places where we have quiet zones, right? All the stuff out in the West is pretty new too. And then there are networks down in the Caribbean, right? You can see down here into Central and South America. Most of these towers in South America weren't up there a year or two ago. And so many of them are popping up now. So lots of people are adding to the network, and that's really helping because it helps us see and get more detections off of the birds that we put tags on.
Is there an alert when one of your birds is detected? Does it come to your computer to say that your code showed up?
Yeah, it's not quite that live. So, when we get data on our towers, we have to upload that data to a network, right? And so if somebody has a tower that they haven't uploaded for a while, you don't know if your bird was there or not until they actually upload that data. So it's not like geofencing, like African elephants, when you get, the people who do that get, cell phone messages that a certain elephant is crossing into an area, right? It's not that level yet. And I say yet because it could be. So just so you know where I'm coming from, so I study migratory birds. I mentioned I study anything that migrates. I've studied salmon. I've actually studied some things that don't migrate, but they use the Earth's magnetic field. So I'm very interested in sort of how animals find their way. And I've listed just a couple of my questions that I have addressed through different research projects here. So over on the side, one thing I've always been fascinated with is the ability of animals to sense the magnetic field. Eastern red-spotted newts do it, birds do it, lots of things do it. And that just shows you the Earth's magnetic field. But birds not only can sense the direction of the magnetic field, so north versus south, but there's some good evidence that they can detect position by how strong the magnetic field is. So using it as like a GPS. So we've done some research on that. The internal factors, so are they ready? Do they have enough fat? Birds have to put on a ton of fat to migrate. We'll talk about one species a little bit that does that. How does that affect their choices? How do they integrate information? So birds not only use magnetic information, they use cues from the sky, right? How do they put that information together? And then social information. So birds use nocturnal flight calls when they're migrating, and we don't know a lot about how those are used during migration or how they facilitate migration. So those are some of the questions I've been involved with researching. Overarching theme is sort of the development of these strategies. So how, when a bird goes from being a naive juvenile bird to an older bird, how its migratory strategies change as it learns information.
Photo period?
Yeah, photo period is sort of like the ultimate sort of cue to sort of get them ready. So a lot of people think migration is about food, and it's really not. I mean, some migration is about food, like eruptive migrants and things like that. But it's what drives the sort of circadian clock for these birds are changes in photo period. So in this, after summer, it's the shortening days, which start changing their physiology so that they put on more fat, preparing to migrate. They may molt before they migrate. This time of year, it's sort of lengthening days, although a lot of the ones coming from the tropics, the days aren't changing that much down there, right? But they do cue into that. And then there's that's sort of the overall cue, and then things like weather patterns, right? They won't fly in headwinds for the most part. They'll wait for tailwinds or calmer nights and things like that. Yeah, so this picture sort of embodies the things I'm interested in. So that's an American redstart. And I did not take this. This came out of National Geographic way back when I was in grad school, just to age myself there. But it shows a map, it's birds flying over a map and a compass, right? So how do they put sort of information together to find their way? How do they know which way they're headed and where they are along their migratory route? And we know they use magnetic cues. We know some birds use celestial cues such as the stars. Birds that migrate during the day may use the position of the sun. And birds, we think, can also detect polarized light in the sky, which changes as the sun moves across the sky. And they probably use that. Even the ones that migrate at night take off around sunset and will land at sunrise. And there's a big band of polarization in the sky at that point, which would give them information about direction. So they have multiple compass mechanisms, multiple ways to find out which way they're going and where they are. And redundancy is good if you're flying several thousands of miles. And realizing, I've studied birds. So we have a field station over in Cuba Lake, and I've banded birds there during the summer and caught the same birds, year after year, many years in a row. And they're literally, coming to the same nest in the same bush. And then they're, headed down to South America. Right. So that's pretty strong ability to find your way across a large landscape, but then to, land here, right, and find a particular bush, right, out in the landscape. That's another sort of feat in and of itself. So before all this tracking, I studied birds in a very different way, and I just wanted to show you another way we study how birds know where they want to go. So I would study birds that were captured, right, and I would study them in orientation cages. So here you can see these are basically flower pots that we purchased from Lowe's, right? And the bottom is removable. We cut it off so I can put a bird in and out. And on top of this cage is a wire mesh so the bird can't get through it. So I can see down into each one of these, right? There's cameras looking down into each one of these. And if you put birds in these cages at night or around sunset, they'll hop around. So here you can see them hopping around. And amazingly, when they're in these cages, in any kind of cage, migratory birds will hop in the direction that they migrated. And this was shown many, many years ago by a very famous German biologist, not Deutschlander, but Deutschlander. And there's all different kinds of orientation cages that have been used to study these captive birds and learn about their directional choices that they make. So what would I do with this? So after these birds jump around, we would analyze that so we could track with the camera, we program to analyze everywhere the bird went, which is like spaghetti in a bowl there. Right, but then we take that information and we look at every time they move out of the center, how the farthest point out they go. We take that as a directional bearing. And then we get rid of all the other information. Over on the right, you can see the bearings of one individual bird. So as it hopped, you can see that bird was hopping to the northwest. Okay. And so we can figure out the direction that bird wanted to go, right? And then we can ask questions about that. So here's some data from individual birds. These are white-throated sparrows, caught in autumn and spring. And these are birds that are divided into fat birds that have a lot of fat deposits. They store their fat underneath their skin, so you can actually blow on their feathers and see how much fat they have. And these are lean birds. And you can see fat birds show seasonally appropriate orientation. South, right, in the autumn, north in the spring, right? But lean birds don't show any sort of orientation. They're sort of randomly distributed, right? So their condition matters in terms of them making their directional choice. So that's something you can learn from a cage study. And there's been lots of cage studies. Most of the cage studies have looked at orientation cues. So I don't have time to go into it today. It'd be a whole other talk. But you can actually, in these cages, change the cues the birds are exposed to. So over here on the right side of the screen, the box, and there's birds in that box. And around that box is a big cube, and there are wires wrapped around that cube. And we're putting electric current through that wire so that we can change the magnetic field direction inside the cube. So there's a rule in physics, a left-hand rule, how you get a magnetic field around an electric current wire. Somebody designed these so that you can actually change. So if you're sitting in here, I can basically give you a compass and you could watch the compass and you'll rotate around to the east as I charge up the pole. And then we can put things, so we can do Q conflict studies. We can change the magnetic field, but leave celestial cues alone. These also have Polaroid filters on them, so I could change the polarization band, but leave the magnetic field alone and see how birds respond. So there's been a lot of studies done like that on a whole bunch of different species. These are just the species in North America. So there's fewer here. These kinds of studies have been done by the Germans and other Europeans for a lot longer than Americans have been studying migration. So the Europeans really started that whole area.
And so are you doing that to see which cues they're taking more influence?
Yeah, so Q conflicts, looking at like, are they prioritizing one over the other? Or are they, are they calibrating one cue with the other cue? There's a natural reason why they need to calibrate, and that's because if you're using a magnetic compass as well as a celestial compass, they don't point to the same spots. So magnetic north and geographic north. So geographic north is literally the point I would stand on where I would just spin around in a circle, right, where the axis of rotation is. Magnetic north can be hundreds of miles away from that, and it moves over at least the scale of decades. And so that creates what we call declination, an error between your two compasses that birds have to correct for, especially at high latitudes. They can be, you could be looking at these two compasses and they can be 40, 60 degrees off, right? And so then you really need to calibrate one with respect to another to use them. And they do, which is pretty cool. So back to Motus. So promise of Motus. So for me, this was about taking the kinds of studies I would do in the cage, right, and translating that up to free-flying birds and seeing what we can learn from those free-flying birds. But there are lots of people using Motus to study all kinds of things. So here's just some of the things that we can learn from Motus. So obviously we can learn the migratory paths and the timing of individuals and populations. We can learn about migratory connectivity. So putting these tags on birds in their breeding grounds, understanding where they go, where they winter, where they stop over. Stopover sites are really important. Songbirds make these journeys. Songbirds can fly, a couple 100 miles in a night. Some birds can fly 1,000 miles before they'll stop. But they always stop, right? And those stopover points are really important for them. Same for shorebirds. Any bird that migrates will have stopover sites where they need to rest, but they also need to refuel because migration is very expensive energetically. We can look at carryover effects. So what I'm doing during breeding may affect how I migrate, right? Or my molting, losing my feathers, shedding my feathers, growing new ones may affect how I migrate. We can look at migration strategies related to timing and energy and orientation. So we can compare long distance to short distance migrants. We look at seasonal difference, age-related differences, and even condition dependence. So we can look at the condition of birds that we tag and then and learn about how it's affecting how they're migrating, how fast they're migrating, and where they're going. And for me, again, I'm interested in learning what we can from Motus to corroborate what we've learned from these cage studies, right? To say, is what we learned about in the cage translatable to what is actually going on in the wild? Because if it's not, then we got to throw that stuff out and start over. But if it is, right, that's handy. So I'm going to show you just a couple studies. I picked a couple of these up to show you there are some cool findings. So here's autumn migratory timing and pace are driven by breeding carryover effects. So these are barn swallows that were tagged up in the Northeast. And they found that barn swallows that finish breeding later in the summer, because barn swallows can actually they can double brood. So they can have one nest and then have another, but not all pairs will have a second brood. So if you have a second brood, you're obviously going much later into the season before you can get ready to migrate. And they found that those birds that they depart later, but they compensate with a quicker pace migration. So, you might, and we wouldn't know that without this. We might think, oh, those birds are going to arrive later. They're going to have different challenges, right? Because they're arriving later, but they're making up for it during migration, partially by flying faster, but also flying with better tailwinds, and also reducing stopovers. So they're not making as many stopovers as the birds that leave early. And again, we wouldn't know that without this Motus tracking. Yeah.
I have a
So,
question. So do you think that that's like that individual bird strategy every single year? It's like one individual bird that does that exchange strategies, or like that's what that bird does?
I think there's definitely like age dependence, like first migration versus second migration differences. Once they're adults, uh, yeah, that's a good question. So yeah, I'm very interested in personalities. So we use that to think about suites of traits, right? That's what a personality is. It's a suite of traits that make you who you are, right? So for birds, we can think about personality types. We tend to think about, are they risk prone or risk averse, right? And what would the choices be in terms of migration? They're doing that, right? Here's a carryover effect. So it's like, well, so I don't have a second brood. That's a cost to my fitness, right? And these guys, it'd be interesting to see, do they always double brood if they're going to be double brooders, or do they double brood some years and not other years? And I don't know that for barn swallow. Here's another one. This is a great cheek thrush. So these were birds that were actually tagged down here in Colombia. So they're flying northward on their spring migration. And they found that variation in the fuel load. So this is a stopover site before these birds cross the Gulf of Mexico. So they fly nonstop over the Gulf of Mexico, maybe making landfall on some of these Caribbean islands. But their fuel loads, so how much fuel they had, how much fat they had before they left, affected how far they would go before they would stop, and resulted in almost a 30-day difference in traveling time for these species, or for these gray-cheeked thrushes. And some of these thrushes, based on when they were detected and how quickly it was, a few of these thrushes flew like 3,000 miles before they stopped. So they kept flying during the next day, which is pretty rare, right? So again, this is looking at condition and how condition affects their choices, right? But also looking at the importance of a stopover habitat, particularly this one in northern Colombia. And this is one that looks at differences between ages. So these are wood thrush that, again, these are birds that were tagged at their wintering sites and then picked up at motor stations along the way up. Right, and I got some data here, but you can see some differences. So number of stopovers, right? Adults make fewer stopovers than juveniles. That difference is even bigger when you look at the U.S. stops. So once they get up into the U.S., the juveniles are stopping a lot more, right? Their migration speeds, because of that, are affected. So the juveniles are migrating faster, right? Our adults are migrating faster than juveniles. So all that results in sort of these changes in dates. So when you look at arrival on breeding grounds, these show, well, here we have ordinal dates. So these are earlier dates in spring, okay? So 95 would be the 95th day of the year, okay? And so if you look at their arrival, so these open symbols are the adults, okay? And squares are males. So adult males are arriving the earliest, right? Adult females are arriving sort of the second earliest, and then the juveniles are arriving much later, with that same pattern of males arriving before females. Right? And what happens, what they found was that basically this gets compounded. So the juveniles leave later, so they depart later from their breeding or from their wintering sites, right? But then they make more frequent stopovers, so it keeps compounding, and they're later and later and later than adults. And arriving early on the breeding grounds is really critical for your reproductive success. Males who arrive first get the best territories. Females that arrive first get the best pick of males. Right, so the juveniles are at disadvantage likely on the breeding season, but it might not be a disadvantage that accounts so much because they might already be at a disadvantage because they're young birds. So they might be slowing down their migration to sort of avoid those sort of costs of competition at the breeding ground. Yeah.
So I put transmitters on bats.
Yeah. Okay. Okay.
You know, their battery life isn't great.
Oh yeah, good question. I didn't say that. So it depends on the tag size, because the tag size is driven by the battery size, right, in the tag. And then it depends on how often you have it send out a signal, which you can pick, right? So you want to have it sending out a signal frequently enough that if it flies by in the middle of a night at Motus tower, you don't you don't miss pinging the tower, right? So like ones that we put on Thrushes at Braddock Bay, they can last for like up to 3 months, for example. Yeah. Yeah, so there's a harness that's used. That's connected to it. Yeah, so that's a good question. So bigger birds, you can put bigger transmitters on with that last longer. Okay. Although I'll show. I have a tag. We're going to get to you guys it later. That has an infinite lifespan. I'll tell you why. Yeah. Well, actually, let me just grab that out now. You can see it. I had Motus tags in here, but I had to give them to somebody else. Yes. This tag I can pass around if you're very careful with it. So there's the antenna. So there are actually, in terms of technology, there are two companies that make these tags. The tags that you saw on the slide are made by a company called Low-Tech, and and it's in Canada. It's the tags that most people have been using. This is made by a company in Cape May, New Jersey called Cellular Tracking Technologies, which makes all kinds of tag devices. This one, and they operate on different frequencies, so there are different antennas you need to collect them. But most towers now collect data on both frequencies. This tag is really different looking than the low-tech tags. First of all, it doesn't have a battery. It has a tiny little solar panel. So this tag is a life tag. It will last forever because it doesn't have a battery that will run out. The problem with this tag is it won't work at night. It doesn't have a battery stored. Right. So the next tag I'm buying from CCT, which they just developed last year, has a solar panel and a battery in it. Aha, so now it's life tag, right, which works at night. So I'll pass that around. So let me show you projects that one project that we've done for one of our pilot projects on blackpoll warblers, and I'll briefly mention a project I'm going to be starting on gray catbirds, and I'm just watching my time. Oh, farm salamanders. Okay, so blackpoll warblers. Blackpoll warblers are really amazing athletes. Okay, that's why I teach physiology. I always tell my students these are the best athletes. So what are these numbers? So that's the number of a lean, 12 grams is the number of a lean blackpoll warbler. 23 grams is the number of a blackpoll warbler during migration. So it doubles its body weight in fat. 9 grams is one that's been found after it's been migrating, or several have been found, but about the weight of a blackpoll warbler when it makes landfall in northern South America. Okay, and what do I mean by that? So blackpoll warblers do something really outrageous. So in the fall, they breed all across the boreal forest. Here you can see the breeding range. All the ones even that are out in Canada, they all go to the East Coast first. Okay, and they pass through all these Canadian provinces and some of the Northeast states, right? And they all basically stage up on the northeastern coast of Canada and the U.S. And then they take off. Instead of going the safe route over land and then the sort of not so safe route over the Gulf of Mexico, like a lot of birds do, they go out over the Atlantic Ocean and don't make landfall until they reach Brazil. So that's 23,000 mile trip. They do it in about 72 hours. It's about 660 miles a day. For people who run, I'm not a runner, I'm a biker. But if you know what a 4-minute mile feels like, it's like doing that for 80 consecutive hours. Because these birds have to flap, right? So it's like 8 consecutive hours on a treadmill after you've doubled your body weight. So you're now carrying all this extra weight. So what that shows you is these birds put on this fat, and then they burn all that fat, and then they burn muscle mass before they make landfall in that migration. But it works, right? It's been selected for.
You see a similar gain in fat in step as opposed to
No, yeah, birds like raptors that use a lot of thermals and stuff for flying, yeah, they don't gain much body mass at all. So this is it's related to flapping. So songbirds certainly do this. If I could restart my ornithological career, I probably would go and study shorebirds because they are even more amazing in terms of the flights they make and the things they do. So they do it too.
And do you know why they're going to Brazil and not just stopping in Florida or?
Well, yeah, they fly out over this arrow, so like they're really hundreds of miles off the coast, right away from land.
Why there and not another warm area, because they don't live in the tropics. So
Yeah, so this is their wintering range, so they're headed here. So they could take this longer route over land, but they basically time minimize.
Yeah,
Right.
no, I was just wondering why they don't winter still and closer, like it's warm.
Oh, yeah.
Why they
Yeah,
don't
some birds
migrate.
do. So some birds are shorter migrants.
Right.
Warblers are basically evolved out of the neotropics. So this warblers, this is where they originally started, and they come up north to breed, and they're returning to their.
Oh, okay, so that was sort of their home.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
So this is a study that first used Motus to look at black hole warblers moving around the Gulf of Maine, and they found that basically adults and juveniles had different strategies for movement, right? The adults were moving in directions more consistent with orientation, right? And juveniles were more random, like they were exploring. And this is one of the first studies I saw that got me interested in using these techniques. So we actually did something similar with birds at Braddock Bay. Here's a black hole warbler with, I barely see the tag up there, but you can see it kind of coming off of it. We tagged adults and juveniles. And then we looked at differences in their movements. So there was no difference in how long they stayed at Braddock Bay. Most birds left within 2 weeks. And the median difference between them was really similar, nothing statistically different. Then we looked at how they departed. So each one of these towers, like our tower, has 4 antennas on it. So this shows the direction of each antenna and the receiving range of each antenna. So you can use that as birds move around, if they're detected by multiple antennas, you can use it to figure out where they are relative to your tower. And so within the last 2 minutes of detection, and this shows detection across lots of different days across all these different towers. So in the last 2 minutes, which would be a little slice of time over here, we take all the antenna detections and we calculate direction, just sort of similar to what we were doing in the funnels, right? But now we're using the antenna detections to show a directionality that they are, so where they are when they leave the area. So if we look at adults and juveniles, they did something very different. So these are the juveniles, these are the hatch years on the bottom here. And these show, these pie plots are basically the number of birds that were in a particular direction when they departed the area. So most of the juveniles were south of the lakeshore. And most of the hatch years, or adults, the after hatch years, were up around the lakeshore. So there's a real big difference in where they are, which is interesting because in the autumn, this is an autumn study, the lakeshore habitat has much better feeding habitat for them. And so the adults are hogging that and probably pushing the juveniles away, right? And then there's a very cool thing you can learn from Motus. Then you can also see, once they leave our tower site, which is there, where else do they get picked up, right? So this is just one bird that moved from Braddock Bay and was picked up at 4 other towers. So it moved along the lakeshore, and then it moved down towards Delaware and Washington. And these are the detections. You can see how long it stayed at each area. I haven't analyzed that data yet. But so we had about half our birds were detected at other towers, which is really good, right? That's much better than banding data. And what we found is that if you look at the immatures, the juveniles, a lot of them moved along the lakeshore first before either continuing east or turning and going to the southeast. Most of the adults just went directly southeast. So I think this is, again, exploration. So the juveniles, it's their first migration. They may be doing a bit more exploring of the local landscape before they're making these departures so that they know about these local landscapes on subsequent migrations. And then, so all the birds go down here and then they disappear, right? They disappear. Why? Because they've gone out across the ocean, right? Did their batteries die? That's possible too, but these are tracks with Swain's instructions banded in the same seasons, and they keep going and get detected by towers all along here, and they have the same tags. So the batteries weren't dead. My black holes just went out over the ocean, and there are no, there are a few towers where they're putting up wind turbines and things. So study that, but not many. So that's one of the studies that we've done. I can't tell you where these guys are going because it's not my study to tell. But they've been picked up by some of those towers way down. So one thing that is great, black holes are fascinating, but it's like, oh, they left the network of towers, right? That was sort of depressing to realize that was going to happen. I should have known that was going to happen. So, so I'm going to be studying something else. I'm going to be studying these guys. These are gray catbirds. This is eBird data. But shows you their ranges during migration. Look at that. They stay within the entire Motus network and where it's getting developed. So I'm going to be studying these guys because I want more data about where they're moving. I don't want to lose them when they go out over the ocean. And we'll be using those tags, like when I'm passing around, which are essentially life tags, but with the battery, so we get detections at night during the day. So I'm going to hopefully learn a lot about where these guys are moving. So I'm putting up a new Motus tower. I'm going to skip that one. At Hobart's field station, which is right about here on Kugel Lake. Here you can see these are some towers that we put up. There's a couple in Montezuma. This one is actually at Seneca Meadows, the garbage one. They've actually funded some of our research. We have a tower up on top of one of their dumps. And then there's a tower down here that Cuba Bird Club's put up. But I'm going to put a tower here, which is our site, and I'm going to be looking at movements of the gray catbirds. Another cool thing about the cellular tracking technologies equipment is they also have these things called nodes. So nodes are not towers, but they're little, I should have brought one, about this big. They're solar powered. You put them up in your habitat like in a grid, and they detect birds, and they send that information to the tower, right? And then they can tell you really fine scale information about where your birds are in a particular habitat. So this is land that we own, and this is a grid that I'm setting up of nodes. And I'm going to be putting it on birds that I know are breeding in this area. So I can get really fine scale movement data about where they are when they're here, and then information about where they are when they're going farther away from where we are, or there's other towers. So that's to come. Maybe I'll give another talk in a couple of years when I have data from that. So questions. Thanks for listening. Thanks for great questions already, but I think I have time for a few more. Right?
Found any birds that used to migrate and they don't now, or the opposite?
There are birds that, yeah, don't migrate anymore. So, there, all these resident Canada geese around here. Those were around decades ago, right? So,
Yeah.
there's a phenomenon sometimes called like short stopping, where birds don't migrate as far as they used to. It's very common in waterfowl that are feeding off agricultural fields, where and the waste from using combines is great, it's mechanical, but it leaves a lot of waste in the agricultural fields. Or even like the snow geese that move through here now. I mean, those you did not see snow geese stopping in New York State 40, 50 years ago like they do. But yeah, I've been told the statement. Oh, no, okay.
Excuse me. So there's like birds don't migrate as much on the west coast because of the temperateness, right? Is that
There are West Coast migrants, but yeah, I mean, it's a bit more central climate.
what they want?
Yeah, I mean, there are like there's I showed a couple thrushes. There are swings and thrushes that breed up in Columbia. Every migration happening. And the tags are small enough tags to put on.
Just like I was same length, or do you?
Yeah, we were just talking about that yesterday. So, because we were saying, oh, one of these gets damaged when we cut it off. It turns out you can cut them, but you have to cut them very specifically. This is the tag that go on a cat. pretty light, it doesn't have battery. So you attach it with a leg loop. So these holes in here.
Yeah.
Have to have just the right length, right? You know, not be. Once they're on the leg loop.
How much do like those like sweaters like cost? Those ones specific.
Yeah, this one was slightly under 200. You're still paying $200 on a bird. Right, so it's still more expensive than banding, but wow, you get a lot more data.
Hey, Mark. I don't know if you can hear me.
Yeah, I mean, climate is impacting the ranges of birds. I mean, the storage is pretty much tied to available. Such a short scale. Relatively small. Oh, okay. I don't know how to see the chat.
Bailey will just read it.
Oh, okay. Allie, you want to shoot a question to me?
Can you hear me?
Hey, Mark, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, so the
I'll
first
hear you.
question, the first question is, how much do the Motus towers cost?
Oh, that depends. So the Cadillac of towers, you can spend $5,000 on a tower, but you can spend less. It sort of depends on how many antennas you're putting up, which depends on your research question, and it depends on power. So if you're at a place that we can plug into power, it's much cheaper than if you have to use solar. The solar drives that up. So like we have the tower we have at Braddock Bay is plugged in. The tower we have on the top of Seneca Meadows has a big solar panel on it. So that's a more expensive tower. And then it depends on the tower itself. So are you putting up a tower or are you putting your antennas on an existing tower?
Okay, thank you. And then just another question, Lisa asks if we need one near Geneva. She sees that there's like not many in the Finger Lakes region.
Yeah, there is. Yeah, so yeah, that'd be nice to have one on the top of Geneva. I don't have one there. Putting up towers without projects is great for everybody who's tagging birds. But for me, like putting up a tower where I'm not tagging birds in that area is sort of more of a waste of resources because you never know. Like the one on Seneca Meadows, for example, picks up birds that other people have tagged. Picked up one of my blackpolls that we tagged at Braddock Bay, right? But it doesn't pick up a lot of birds. And it's in a really good location in terms of it should, but we're not tagging birds there. So it's just picking up birds by chance, right? Where if I put a tower in an area where I'm tagging birds, I get that local data, right? And then when they get picked up by other towers, I get that regional data. When I first started, the Stu McKenzie, who's in Bird Studies Canada, he said, you really got to count on your local data. Like that's your meat and potatoes, right? And the other stuff is gravy, but now there's a lot of gravy because there's a lot of towers. But if you want to put up a tower, if anybody's interested in putting up a tower with bird clubs or whoever's asking that question, certainly contact me and I can help you. Chelsea and I have been talking about one here.
Thank you.
Oh, cool. All right, good.
So Allie,
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, that'd be good. I'm not sure at all about the insect tags. I know they've been using them. Oh, yeah, well, you're selecting in that you have sort of a calculated lean body mass. Right, so, I could get a bird that has some fat on it, but is, let's say the lean body mass is 12 grams, and I get a bird that is 12 grams, but has like, significant amount of fat. That means its lean body mass is actually much less than that 12. And so I wouldn't tag that bird with a tag that I know is 3% of 12 grams, right? Because then so yeah, so but for, and it depends on the project. You might be, we were selecting adults and juveniles. We were trying to have, they don't arrive on the same day, so we couldn't day match them in any way, but we were trying to get equal numbers of those. So it just depends on your project. You might not tag every bird. And we get a lot more black holes at Braddock Bay than we tagged with nano tags. We just didn't have, we had a certain number of nano tags. Yeah.
So with that 3% rule you're talking about, does that also go for?
Yeah, well, the bands are way less than that.
Okay, so it's
Yeah.
not to worry about.
No, bands are way under that. Yeah.
Programs to fatten up the birds before they fly.
For like that we have. You got your bird feeder, right? So you're helping out with that.
Say we're in the Central America and the other countries where actually, do they have any wildlife programs that they try to work?
Well, I don't think purposely to fatten them up. I think there's a lot of research on making sure that the habitat quality is good for particular species, right? And part of that is making sure they have plenty of food to eat, right? So, I mean, like in the tropics, one project related to that is, getting coffee plantations to be bird-friendly, shade-grown coffee plantations rather than monoculture, sun-grown coffee, right? And there's a group at Cornell that works a lot with sort of local coffee growers to kind of get them to transfer over to these different kinds of ways of growing coffee. And the birds actually provide benefits to those plantations too, because they get rid of a lot of the insects and things that are in them.
Like a permaculture, or is that what they're trying to plant with the coffee plants? Other plants to bring the birds?
Yeah, well, just structure, right?
Oh,
Traditionally, coffee is planted like we grow corn. We clear everything out and we just plant corn. And that's what, so you have these monocultures of coffee. You've destroyed habitat, you've destroyed rainforest, right? And you're not going to get birds there. You need variety of habitat to get birds there.
question for you on scouts. Now, when they say that with purple martins or whatever, they'll send out like certain scouts for new homes, but if they come back to the same one all the time, are they, if the scouts young birds that need to go find their own home?
Yeah, you have to have dispersal, right? So, which is interesting with migration. So, I mean, in any species, young disperse away, right, from their natal areas, right, at least far enough to prevent inbreeding, right, because inbreeding comes with genetic costs and health costs. So, yeah, that would be tied into dispersal. Because part of what birds, and that's, I think, part of what young birds are doing before they migrate is sort of scouting out in terms of next year's, where am I going to go, right? Now, some birds are cooperative breeders, and the young will come back and they won't breed for a few years, and they'll help parents raise young. But that's only in certain species.
And the secondary question is when you talked about with insects, you was talking about butterflies. I wondered if anybody's invented yet to have like mice eat something and that are near your house or whatever, and you could see where they're getting in from. Because it's almost impossible to keep, if you live in the country, mice out of your house. But if I was able to radio track, and I thought of this a long time ago when I was battling the mice, and but I said some smart person's gonna invent where they eat something and now somehow we can see which entryway they're getting in, what crack, what little area to block. And because, hopefully there's only one or two or whatever,
Yeah.
your house isn't like a sieve, but it's hard to find to keep them out. Like, where are they coming in from?
Yeah, and probably tracking would only give you limited ability to, keep them out. Have you ever seen the Nathan Lane movie, Mouse Hunt? Oh, there's a good lesson. You'll never win against them. Good movie if you like Nathan Lane.
I thought that would be cool because then that's a way for even companies like bakeries or all different. To
Yeah,
keep them-
that's pretty fine scale though, right? That, like, you need, radio tracking doesn't give you that level of scale.
Yeah, almost like when you were doing the squirrel, trying to find a squirrel, you have like a transmitter that you could figure out where they are.
Yeah, but that's still pretty rough. It's not like that hole right there.
Can somebody people? You'd be like a ball cat.
All right, I know you want to do the salamander thing, right? And it's 7:10, so, all right. So thank you all. I can stay for a few more minutes, but I don't want to get trapped till 10 o'clock.
So, yeah, thank you everybody for coming. Certainly if you have another question or two, although I think Mark has to leave as well.
Yes, but I can take one or two more.
So yeah, I don't want to rush you out of here, but we were trying to get people out kind of before dark. That's when the salamanders do come out. And if you are going to stay and help, I think that there's salamander stuff in the research. Stay. Where are you going to bring her? Salamanders?
Yeah.
So the salamanders are crossing the road. We're literally just putting them from like one side of the road to the other.
And they'll figure out.
Yep.
Where do they
They
end
know
up?
exactly where they're going.
Thank you.
Bye, thank you.
Bye.
So if you are
If you had anything to do with Braddock Bay, I've been in contact with Andrea.
Oh, yeah.
About